Dr. Chuck the Science Schmuck. Synchronize. I have the feeling that this experiment is going to get out of hand way faster than I thought. But let's start simple. This. What is this thing? More importantly, why is this thing? Well, the why also explains the what. This is a small aquarium. I found it while I was unpacking things. Like I found a lot of things. This was actually in a previous video of mine that never got published where I was growing sea monkeys in it. That's why it looks a little dirty. I found this... Did I actually? Did I post that video? I don't know. I don't remember what I posted, what I haven't. In case I didn't cover it then, this is a small plexiglass aquarium. These were relatively commonly produced at Walmart like 5-10 years back. It's a 1.5 gallon size aquarium. Weird profile on it. All sort of plexiglass. The idea of these was for betta fish, which, interestingly, I used to sell aquariums, and I used to sell a lot of betta fish. And you ask yourself, can a betta fish survive in this container? Yes, they can do reasonably well. I prefer to keep them in a bigger aquarium than 1.5 if at all possible, but they can do okay in one of these. I've had them in these. The only big issue is that this aquarium kit did not come with a heater. Betta fish don't do well if the temperature is below tropical, so really you shouldn't let them go below like 70 degrees. So if your house is always 70 degrees, always 75 degrees, that's fine, but you don't want them going into the 60s. These kits came with one of these, which is... it goes in like that. So... To describe what this is in a way that would be straightforward and comprehensible to people who are not me would be possible, but I don't think you care terribly much about the long and storied history of aquariums. This device is meant to be an undergravel filter. What is an undergravel filter? Well, back in the ye olde days of yore, aquariums didn't have good filters. The kind that sticks on the side and actually filters didn't really exist. What you would do is you would have a device like this, which would sit underneath a large bed of gravel. Into this, you put a bubble generator, so an air stone, a device that creates bubbles. When bubbles flow up, they flow through the system, and they come out the top, and they drag water with them. Just because they're going up anyway, they're going to take the water with it, which causes a negative pressure on the bottom, so the water, in theory, goes through the gravel, goes under the undergravel filter, and then up. Since the gravel has a high amount of surface area, it contains the bacteria necessary for the aquarium to actually process nitrogen products. So it pulls it through a complicated system of bacteria, and back then in like the 60s, every single aquarium had many plants. So it would pull it through the roots, and that would create the essentially the filtering aspect. The thing is, that never really worked great. It's why you don't see undergravel filters today, and it only really works if the aquariums are about as big as this desk, which I've checked the camera. You cannot actually see how big this desk is. It's this big. I forgot what I'm talking about. Weirdly, this doesn't stink as much as you would think it would. So essentially, the undergravel filter in this thing doesn't actually do anything. But that's just an aside, really, because I'm trying to explain the very strange thing that I thought of the other day. So I was sitting somewhere and thinking, as I'm apt to do, and I was thinking, well, what in the world can I do with this tiny aquarium? I can't really have fish anymore, because they actually live a surprisingly long time if they're taken care of well. I'd rather just do something with plants. I wasn't going to do sea monkeys again, because it turns out they're actually kind of boring. I hear either screaming or a car screeching into something. Because considering it's from that side and it's just forest and one weird orange streetlight in the middle of a field, I don't think it's from cars. So it's fine. The device that I thought of involving this system is called a Paludarium. I wrote it on my hand so that I'd be able to pronounce it because I have never said that word before. Congratulations, you have witnessed the first time in my entire life I have successfully said whatever that word is. I've already forgotten how to say it. Now that is a thing where if you look up people who are competent and not schmucks on YouTube, many people have produced whatever that is of why am I wet? essentially incredible quality. So these are people who can produce systems just unfathomably, I'm still wet, unfathomably beautiful, complicated systems, multiple gallons, huge systems. One of whatever these are, these paludariums, are systems in which there is a combination of water, as you would see in an aquarium, but then in some form or another, rising land from it, so that terrestrial plants and animals can coexist with aquatic plants and animals. That's pretty cool. That's also big, expensive, and actually requires skill. But I thought, well, I don't have any of those things, but I do have... I was going to say fortitude, but not really. I have this tiny aquarium. I can use that. So my thought was, why don't I turn this into a very, very tiny paludarium? Because that'll work, right? It actually occurred to me that because of its weird shape and this weird tube in the middle, that actually might have, I mean, this weird ominous tube is going to potentially give me an advantage. If I use that tube to center like a central column of land, I can have it rise up along that tube, and that will be the central core, like a mountain in the middle of water, which would probably go up to like here, probably be about that much of dirt or gravel, and if it is gravel and not sand, it may even be able to flow. But then I thought, well, how in the world am I supposed to do that? You look up these actual professionals who know what they're doing, and they're like, I got this expensive compound that you can, merge and compress, and it looks just like dirt, and then you can plant plants in it. I'm like, I don't have the time to figure out things. I'm a schmuck. So I had the sudden realization that, well, why don't I just use ordinary rocks and drill holes in them? That realization was quickly closhed, quickly squashed, ripply roshed, quickly squelched by the fact that I cannot easily drill a hole in most rocks. You ever tried to drill through a rock? It takes forever, and it doesn't actually work. I can't even drill through cast iron. I've tried. I've even heated it up and tried. It doesn't go through. Rocks can't really be effectively drilled with the type of equipment I have. So then I started thinking. That's always a dangerous situation when I sit down and just start thinking. It occurred to me, why don't I use concrete? Well, all the air just came out of me. Why don't we use concrete in aquariums? Concrete is very shapeable, it's very durable, it's very sturdy. Why don't we just mold that into whatever I need? The answer is because concrete is made of calcium carbonate. Not really, but more or less. The problem with that is that in most aquariums, the water is either neutral or acid. So what does that actually do to concrete? It slowly dissolves it. Not to a degree where it would be appreciably destroyed, but to a degree where the pH of the water will slowly start going up. Now, in something like a saltwater aquarium, that's probably okay. Saltwater is naturally very alkaline. It's like a pH of somewhere between 8 and 9. The type of water for cichlids, which are a type of fish, specifically the Malawi and Tanganyika cichlids, live in very alkaline water. They can tolerate that sort of stuff. But usually you don't put carbonate materials. So no marble objects, no pieces of shells, no crushed shells, no concrete in an aquarium, because it will change the water chemistry in a way that's negatively affects your fish. Or plants. Plants don't usually grow that great in hard alkaline water. They prefer softer, which just means less minerals dissolved in it, acidic water. Not too acidic, but usually more on the acid side for most species of aquatic plants that you'll commonly find. Now, some people will tell you, oh, the concrete is leaching toxic, heavy chemicals into the water and affecting the fish. The fish aren't really very sensitive to that at all. It's more just the alkalinity changing. I mean, what, is the lead going to give your fish brain damage? The chips don't taste as bad as you'd think. So, I've spent like 5, 10, 20 minutes very boringly, and without doing anything interesting, voicing the overall problem I'm having. I'd like to cast these in concrete, but I can't exactly, except I can, and I'm going to. And not much is going to stop me at that point. So, firstly, our good old friend, sifted concrete. Now, you may be asking, why did I sift the concrete? Because this project doesn't actually require concrete that's to a high degree of moldability. You could leave the aggregate in. Well, I saved the aggregate. An interesting thing you learn from sifting a lot of different concrete is that the aggregate, or stone material, in concrete varies vastly between different localities and manufacturing centers. What I found, there's a piece of it over here after I washed it off, is that this aggregate, I'm not some sort of mineralologist here. I don't even watch Steven Universe. But this looks a lot like marble, which is entirely feasible. It could be that that's just the aggregate they chose. But you may remember that I very clearly said I should not use marble in an aquarium. Why? Because marble is calcium carbonate. It is a specific type produced by the metamorphic effects of the earth on limestone. It dissolves in water, very minimally, but it does have the same effects as like a piece of shell or a piece of concrete. So it's not something I want to have in the water, which is unfortunate because that would make this a lot easier. Also, I'm not 100% sure it is marble. It could be quartzite. But I'm not going to take that chance. We're just going to use the sifted material. And now is where I reveal some secret and proprietary knowledge. That is sugar. So, this doesn't make sense right now, but what I'm going to do is dissolve that sugar into hot water to produce a highly saturated syrup. Well, okay. So, I've gotten the sugar, which is here. It's still steaming and still very hot. I've also gotten this container, which this will be the molding container. Concrete molding is oddly challenging because it's functionally a liquid most of the time. So what I've done is filled this box with peat moss. Why peat moss? I have a lot of it. Relatively innocuous material, totally non-toxic, doesn't readily bind to concrete, and it's pretty sturdy. Additionally, I've found that it's pliable enough to make pits or molds, which is what I've done. So I have these, which are pipes, which are designed to be about the same diameter of this. So this will be to mold the holes. When that's done, I'll, in theory, just kick those out of the concrete or pull them. So what I've done is simply insert this into an area and then kind of imagine the negative space becoming a positive space. The main difficulty being there's very little clearance back here. It's about a finger width of clearance that the concrete would have to go around. Although in theory it doesn't actually have to. I could snap that off and then just build it in the front, but then you'd have holes in the back. So it would be very directional, which, it's over here, probably looks good until you figure that that's meant to be the front of the aquarium. You don't look at it down the front like that at the point. You either look at the side or the back. So if possible, I'm going to avoid doing that. But now you may be wondering, and I'm not 100% sure. I don't know who you are exactly. I know who some of you are. Why have you prepared delicious hot boiled syrup to make concrete? And that's where a weird thing that I happen to know comes in. Yeah, I guess that does warrant some level of explanation. So, the basic theory of that is something that I inadvertently discovered a long time ago before I had this channel when I was trying to construct myself a bulletproof vest. I did not test it, that is why I am alive. But what I found is that when I combined concrete and highly saturated sugar, it produced concrete that was incredibly weak upon hardening. So friable I could snap it with my hands. However, when that concrete was then pyrolyzed, or cooked, it became very hard, black, and glass-like. Now, what does pyrolysis mean? I feel like I've gone over this before, so I may have actually made this concrete stuff. I did. I did make this before. That's what I'm remembering. It's revisited in more ways than I thought. The cube was built out of this material. I don't know where the cube is. I know I unpacked it, but the thing got away from me. So if you see it, let me know. If you have a bunch of organic materials in a solution, which there would actually be probably no nitrogen in a sucrose solution, when you heat that in the absence of oxygen, because if you heat that in oxygen, it's just going to burn. Burnt sugar just turns into carbon dioxide. That's it. It just disappears. But if you heat a carbon-bearing substance in the absence of oxygen, it tends to warp away non-oxygen or non-carbon items, leaving behind only carbon, which is what charcoal is. It is wood that has been cooked, either because it's in the bottom of a fire and the fire can't get to it, or actual medieval charcoal factories, even modern charcoal factories, is building a fire and then covering it and letting it just cook itself. The idea is that the concrete then, when pyrolyzed, contains a large amount of sugar, which becomes almost solid inert carbon. Which is ideal here, because if the surface is made of inert carbon, carbon doesn't dissolve in water. So a large portion of the surface area then won't really break down and pollute the water with increasing alkalinity. So all I would then have to do is basically just seal it so that the water doesn't, intercalate into the deeper portions of the material, and then treat it, and it should be safe for aquarium use. It'll also be a pleasant black color or dark color. The cube, when I made it, weirdly was at such a size where it didn't quite pyrolyze appropriately, but these are much smaller pieces. So what I'm going to do is take my sifted concrete, I'm going to mix it, because sifting can produce asymmetrical distributions in how it is ultimately made, meaning that fine particles will collect more towards the bottom, whereas if you sift something long enough, larger particles do start to get through, and those will collect on the top. That'll be like microaggregate. So that is part of the reason why I use sifted concrete and not mortar. Sifted concrete does contain aggregate still, it's just very small. It's sand. There's basically sand in this stuff. Sand and cement. That's what this stuff is made of. So I'm going to apply this hot sugar to the concrete. You may notice I'm using a screwdriver. Not 100% ideal. I had to throw away all my bamboo sticks. But concrete doesn't really stick effectively to metal, so if I just wash the thing off, it will neutralize the effect. Especially since this is not ordinary concrete, this is sugar concrete, which is, in its even fully cured, non-pyrolyzed form, very soft. The sugar tends to disrupt the hardening process very substantially. Yeah, great. I still don't want to touch it. 1, it's very hot, because this is nearly boiling temperature. 2, it's very sticky, because it's made of sugar syrup. 3, it is concrete, so it is slightly corrosive. See, it's a slightly darker color than normal concrete, and it's starting to harden up. So, let me just check the sizing on that. The advantage of peat moss is, if you squeeze it a little, you can squeeze it into shape around the edges, shrink it down. Admittedly, peat moss will be bonded to this concrete, but that's fine, because it's going in an aquarium anyway. Let me see if I can get you a view of what this... Let me just size that one more time. Oop. So that puddle right there is the first. This is to size them, so I can tell that it does need a little more compression, but it will fit on top of this grate, because this grate is just slightly smaller than the actual size of the aquarium. I've set up the columns for the other puddles, so I will get those in place, and then wait for them to begin hardening before I can begin the pyrolysis. Well, okay. Time has passed, very slightly. In that, concrete usually takes between 24 to 48 hours to cure properly, but not when you've made it out of syrup. So I've given it a week. It's been about a week since I poured these. And I did actually previously go through and pull these out while they were still relatively soft. Except for one. One was not soft. I had to hit it with a hammer a lot. That's kind of the weird thing about these, is I expected these materials to be relatively friable, which friable means breakable, like asbestos. It didn't turn out that way, which leads me to wonder if I actually added enough sugar. However, this is a good-looking specimen that's not covered in peat moss. You can see that the surface is overall darker than concrete should be, and shiny. And in a few places, it's not very apparent on the camera, but sometimes it develops sort of crystallizations of sugar, which does lead me to wonder. It doesn't exactly taste sweet, a little sweet, but mostly like peat moss. So I'm pulling these out. I can wear off some of the peat moss on the back. I'm hesitant to wash them because I don't want to remove soluble sugar yet from their surface. The surfaces have largely become flat because the concrete sinks, but the bottoms are sort of hill-shaped. These were 2 samples. This was intended just to represent the dry material. I will wash that one. This one was, as you can see, very obvious. The flat and the not flat. You notice there's no hole. That's a test sample. Now, there's a few others. That one is pretty big. I don't know how exactly they'll stack, or if they'll even fit. I haven't gotten that far yet. So these do contain a large amount of permeated organic matter, which probably wouldn't be good if I was actually trying to cast something like legitimately a shape in peat moss. But for a situation where I want to bind them to an aquarium where they need an organic layer to have plants and algae growing on them, that's probably going to be beneficial, or it's going to start a fire during the pyrolysis, which, if the pyrolysis is actually performed properly, shouldn't happen. Because pyrolysis needs to be in the absence of oxygen. So 1, I can't use plastic. This is actually the... See? Yeah, that's sweet. That's a residue of the concrete. So, there's a bunch of that. Important to use metal. Can't use plastic in the oven at these temperatures. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to set these in nice and neat, including the non-hole. This one will not actually go in the... Oh no, it wore off after a week. Whatever this thing's called, this one won't go in it. That's just as an example. But you look at that. They fit very nicely. They look like delicious donuts, and actually probably contain a similar amount of sugar to delicious donuts, and a similar amount of peat moss. Now, I could put these in the oven as is and just heat them up, but that's not really going to do what I want it to do. Yes, it will pyrolyze sugar in the middle of it, but I don't care about what's in the middle of these things, because that's not exposed to the actual biological system here. I care about the surface, so we may need to take extra steps to do the surface later, but what I'm going to do... Heavy! To take this here sand... and not taste it. Tried that. Messed up my teeth a little. And then I smoothed the sand out over the top so that they are buried. Now you may say to yourself, sand is permeable to both oxygen and water, and that's kind of the point. These are full of water. Concrete inherently, this one's not getting pyrolyzed, is inherently full of water, both structurally and just there is water inside this structure. I tested that by putting a piece of that in the microwave, and it didn't do anything except get hot, which kind of indicates that there was water in it. I was kind of hoping for an explosion, but it's probably better it didn't, because I eat almost all my food out of that microwave, and exploded concrete would make it gritty. So anyway, I expect water to be off-gassing as steam, both from this slightly damp sand itself and from the concrete. Any off-gassing it does will rise up through the sand and escape, but the sand also limits the ability for oxygen to enter and actually cause anything resembling a fire. The question will just be how long it takes to get this whole system to heat up to an adequate degree. So that's the hard part, and that's where I think the cube had problems, is that it did not get to a high enough degree to turn the whole concrete 500 degrees. Even the banana project, that was in there for like 3-4 hours in a gas oven. I don't think that even got the center absolutely hot. This is going to take a while, and it may set off every smoke alarm in the building, which is why I'm doing this very late at night when everyone else is sleeping. It's also raining outside, so maybe, that's kind of neither here nor there. So I'm going to go put this in the oven, and maybe bake cookies? Whether or not I do will depend on how much smoke this actually makes, because I may need to cover it. I'll probably put a cookie sheet on top of it to keep it covered, and I'll give it a bake and see what it does. They're very warm, fresh out of the oven. Brownies. Sort of. Not really. So, just to be clear, this is the sample that was not cooked. It is still gray in color. Not as sweet, because I washed it with water. Interestingly, it does look a little shinier, the reason being it's very sensitive to water. It dissolves pretty readily and breaks down, at least the surface portion does. Which probably means that in its raw form is not terribly ideal for this purpose. Versus, these are very hot, so I have to be careful. See, I just dripped some water on them and they're steaming. Versus the brown color of these things. They've assumed this much more brown tinge to them, which is the carbon turning into carbon, or the sugar turning into carbon. So they have cooked. It took about an hour and a half. Interestingly, one had some PVC on it, and for some reason the PVC dust turned orange. Didn't expect that. They are quite warm. I don't really have a real viable way to pick a hold of them. You can see that has become quite dark in color. And the other side is full of, now, largely crusty, heavily carbonized peat moss. However, the process doesn't seem to have been 100% complete in that they are still roughly concrete-like. So I'm going to take an additional step in that concrete is a very porous substance. It's like a tiny molecular sponge. It's full of tiny holes that allow air and water to move through it. That's why that bowl is right there. That's full of the week-old syrup from when I originally made these. I had extra. So I'm going to dunk these back in it and allow them to sit in the syrup. Because right now they're very dry. They don't have too much of their own water in them anymore. It's been pulled out. That will seep into their pores, and then once they're taken out and dried again, it'll condense sugar into the pores. Sugar that will then become carbon when I do a second round of carbonization. This time probably without the sand. I was hesitant to do it at night because this smells quite strong. Like really old Christmas cookies that don't have a distinct flavor. It's just sort of sweet, like old caramel, which is basically what it is. So I'll probably do it again, but I'd rather do it in the day so that when the smoke detectors do go off, when these actually start catching on fire, that it's not like 12 at night and I don't wake people up. So this is kind of a waste of sugar, but I shouldn't be eating that sugar anyway. It's terrible for me. I've been using, actually have been eating some of it on my oatmeal in the morning. And it's good. Very sticky. This is going to be so sticky. Now here we do see something of a problem in that pot where I keep my coffee is smoking. It isn't actually. Underneath there is a hole that leads to the actual oven. And I think that the oven is producing, apparently a lot of smoke. That's under the microwave is a fan that's venting outside, so hopefully the alarms won't go off, but I'm shutting down the heat on that for now, and then I'll see if they're in a condition where they're usable, and how badly I've cooked them. However, I do consider that the system is working. This is probably supposed to happen. And I probably should have brought a fire extinguisher in advance. Well, the results initially appear very heavily carbonized. They look kind of like either the world's worst brownies or moon rocks. They won't stay looking like this, though, because most of that surface is just swelling shiny, glossy sugar, which has at this point converted largely to shiny, glossy carbon. So I will have to wash these to get that off first to see what the actual material underneath looks like. But this is what they look like straight out of the oven. And my atmosphere right now is pretty smoky, so that was a bit of a mistake, but that is one of several possible ways to learn how not to do things, or rather the consequences of doing things, because I will not stop doing it. Okay, the secondary cooking process is now done, and it was much smokier than I expected. The alarm didn't go off, but the whole place reeks like somebody exploded into caramel. The resulting product, they're still a little wet because I just washed them, actually looks like what I expected. They're, compared to what they would have originally been, this original sample, versus this now heavily blackened carbonized sample. I did spend quite a bit of time, and cut a hole in my thumb, wiping off all of the extra carbon crust on these things, which is a combination of carbonized peat moss and just bubbled caramelized sugar. The result being pieces that they look like little mini volcanoes. They're flat on one side and then very rough on the other. Just to be sure, though, these are not 100% usable in an aquarium situation right now, mainly because there's a lot of stuff still in there. There's potentially non-dissolved sugar, non-dissolved semi-pyrolized sugar, called caramel, basically, as well as probably some other various pieces of carbon and such. So what I'm going to do is put these back in the bowl. This one can stay out as the sample. What I'm going to do is fill this up with water and let them soak. But in addition to just soaking, I'm also going to add some of the peat moss that I had been using before. Yes, I know, I just cleaned them. Now I'm getting them dirty again. And that peat moss stuff. Smells like peat moss and sneezes. That will turn your mucus black if you breathe it. So don't breathe it, even though it smells good. Part of the thing here is that peat moss is relatively acidic. So it's not as acidic as something like vinegar. It produces a lot of humic acid, which if you try to ask me to identify that chemically, I can't, because humans are not my area of forte, and structurally, humic acid refers to a whole bunch of dark-colored organic acids. It's more an appearance rather than an actual chemical substance, although they do share some chemical, stuff. The idea being that the slightly acid conditions will percolate into the concrete and help further dissolve any extra calcium carbonate that's on the surface and get them really shored up and ready for a situation where they're going to be in water. Some of the peat moss may also, like peat moss microparticles, may get in there. The idea is to have a very carbonized, rough, organic-ready surface. In the same way that coral really likes to form on calcium surfaces, a lot of stuff in freshwater prefers like a biofilm, like a carbon, rough concrete. It doesn't need to be carbonate, but it needs a surface to bind to for the bacterial film. So I'm going to add water to this and let them sit for a while to get properly percolated. How long will that take? I have no idea. At this point, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. My coffee supply has run out because I was using the pot to boil these. And they are quite boiled. I mean, that's a very pleasant-looking block of carbonized concrete. Much better, in terms superficially at least, than the cube came out. They're a little bit friable still. Don't entirely know what that is. Whether that's sugar, dried up carbonized peat moss, or actual pieces of the concrete. But yeah, I boiled them in peat moss water for like an hour. So they look quite nice. Very black. Very, smelly. They smell like burnt stuff. Oh well. So I got the tank. I rinsed it with water, as opposed to rinsing it with not water. So now I gotta fill it. I hear a lot of sound. You probably don't, so that doesn't really matter. So what I've got is some sand. Now why sand, you ask? And well, I don't have a good answer to that question, so don't ask it. Now it clearly says on the side, do not use for hardscape projects, aquariums, or traction. Which leaves me to wonder what in the world is this sand actually meant for, because that's the only 3 reasons you really buy a bag of sand. That's like a 50-pound bag. What's it for? Soft texture, extra fine, ideal for sandboxes. So it's sandbox sand? I don't know, but not for aquariums? I don't take orders from a plastic bag, generally. I've taken some of that sand, put it in a bowl, and rinsed it. Why? Because sand is a pain to work with in aquariums. I don't know if you've ever made an aquarium, but sand is not really an ideal substrate for the main reason that it gets everywhere. It's very gritty. It goes in your filters and messes some stuff up. But in most aquarium settings, it's actually more ideal than a lot of gravel. various fish and animals can swim and move through the sand, intercalate into it. They can sift through it, find their food and stuff. It just gets kicked up, floats much more higher than gravel, and before the tank is fully filtered and stuff, it will have very fine silica particulates, which will make the water cloudy. Those will eventually filter out somehow. Or you could flocculate it, but I don't really recommend flocculating in water that's meant to not be flocculated. So how do I want to actually set up this little aquarium? So I got the under gravel filter here. In this case, the question is... I do not want to knock over. I was looking for that bowl earlier. That's a bowl full of pure stickiness. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull this out and add some of this wet sand to the bottom to produce the fundamental low layer, which will be a thin layer designed for anaerobic digestion of nitrogen, which really isn't necessary in an aquarium this size. That's not going to have fish in it. But it's what I feel like doing, and nobody is here to stop me. So that'll be the sub-layer below the under gravel filter, which probably won't do much. I would like to add bacteria to that, other than that was on my fingies. I have actually. Yes, this will probably work. This is a small Winogradsky column that is in the process of developing. I don't know if the video where I made these is ever going to get posted. If it does, it'll be posted far in the future. I made these far in the past. So we're in the present, which is somewhere between the two. Although actually you're in the distant future, and I'm in your past by a considerable margin. So I'm going to mix that up and... pour in a little bit of Winogradsky microorganisms. They don't smell very good. The smell of gelatin decaying under anaerobic conditions smells like an exploded diaper. Weirdly, the smell is much, much, much worse in the saline version. So. Do I want to set that down as is, or do I want to put another layer on top? I think I'm going to go with just another layer. So what is this? Oh, it's really heavy. This is pea gravel. Now, if you've ever been to the aquarium store as of recent, or even the Walmart, gravel is normally sold in 1-pound bags for approximately $5 per pound. It's very expensive. But you can get this stuff, which is basically the same stuff, except it's not wax-coated, for $5 for this bag that's so heavy I can almost not lift it. And the cool thing about pea gravel is that it's very difficult to make. Because, you know, compared to like crushed stone, with the right equipment, anyone can crush stone, but very few people can... I'm going to throw down a layer of that. Set the under gravel. If I put planning into my projects, they'd come out correctly. And that's no fun. And then add a little sand to just fill in the gaps a little bit. But the idea is to have the top layer be, you know, permeable, because that's where it's going to draw from if it functions as a cycling system. Which I don't know if it will. Now, these can be inserted one of two ways. They have a flat surface because of how they were made, or a lumpy mountainous surface. The idea, my table is coated in sticky and resistors, so I'm going to try to not get too messy. The idea is to organize these somewhat based on size, because I do not think they will all individually fit. Now that one is a little too big to go on the bottom. Oh no, that's about the right size to go on the bottom. So I'll put the biggest one down first. Yeah, that seems to work okay. Let's see if this one... that one can go on top of it. But then there's a little bit of space left over. I feel like I sized it so perfectly I can't not use all the pieces. Okay. I'm too gritty to directly manipulate this. So what I'm going to do is fill it with water and then come back for the next part once I ungrit myself. Although I don't know how I will maintain my perseverance without the correct level of grit. Yeah, okay, I know. It looks odd. Level subject to change, let's say. I can add more or less water depending on how much of this I want to be exposed or not. And we'll get to it when we get to it. But one thing I'd like to see, if is possible, and this is something I actually oftentimes will do this stuff a little bit before, just to test out to see if it may or may not work. Haven't done this before. First time testing it on camera. Should do that more often. That's how you get to see fires. Couldn't find an air stone. So I took a piece of airline tubing, which this is what airline tubing is. It's clear vinyl tubing that's used to conduct air in aquariums. I poured hot glue into the end to seal it off, and then I drilled a bunch of holes in it. So, let me turn this slightly so that you can see it somewhat. These are standard air pumps. This one's, what size is this? This is a 2 watt, so that's about the size you would use for a small aquarium. Just an ordinary cheap diaphragm pump. So there's actually a little bellows in there connected to a little arm that's magnetically operated, so it goes. Must be cold. I can't move my fingers very fast. Nerves aren't firing well. Need to eat more fire. Yep, it turned on. So that can generate bubbles as if it were an air stone. What I want to know is what happens when I stick it in the middle. Interesting. It's more foamy than I expected. So what's happening there is probably the fact that there's residual protein materials in this water, both from that and these. It's bubblier than it should be. I don't know if you can see it. It's making bubbles. The idea is that the upward welling of bubbles draws water with it, causing water to move in an upward direction, and that's actually enough force to raise water through a sealed column. Meaning it could potentially make an almost fountain-like system. Which is why you do see that when I put it in, some amount of water, largely in the form of bubbles, does come up. Don't know why it's so bubbly. However, although that's probably adequate for what I would possibly need to do, I also have this 3.5 watt pump. This is more what you would see for an air stone in something like a 10-gallon aquarium. These usually have 2 outputs. I have put them together, which is just about the stupidest thing you can do, even though it's not, because it essentially doubles the effective output. Because they're one bellows pumping 2, one arm pumping 2 bellows, so it's pump, 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 pump. So it's not doubling the pressure so much as it's potentially doubling the volume. These things don't have that much pressure. That's why I wouldn't use them in like an 80-gallon high. You'll probably never see an 80-gallon high in your life. That's a custom size. Although it may not be immediately apparent, this pressure is adequate to cause an upwelling of water out the top of the system that then rains back down upon the top surface of the aquarium, or paludarium. It's not even on my hand, and I said it largely right. Probably if I tilted it slightly so that the water would go off the front, where you're supposed to be looking instead of out of the back of the assembly. It's not meant to be like an overflowing waterfall at that point. This is somewhat loud. It's a viable pump, though. It's only 1.5 more watts than the other one. These don't take a lot of power. The idea of that system would be, if plants were inserted, which they would be inserted in this crevice or on the surface, probably more clinging plants than anything else, it would provide them with a continuous stream of water, keeping this top continually moist. I don't know what kind of plants are going to be there. I don't even know if there's going to be plants in this video. Okay, despite the fact that this thing can't seem to focus, I have assembled some level of planting inside this system. There's some random plants down there that I got out of a rancid pond I was wandering through. I've affixed some moss to the center. That's a Java fern, some micro sword that I got at a local pet store. I did notice that this thing does tend to foam a lot. Like, the water flowing up to the center is very foamy. So I redirected it back over here. So as you can see, there's the foam now escapes out that pipe and into this tube, or this peanut butter jar, that contains sacks of carbon as well as gravel, and then siphons back by the secondary tube over here. So that's essentially acting as an external filter powered by the internal suction generated by this very loud pump. The lid right now is a little bit of an issue. I need to replace this. It's a big glass plate. This thing is an LED light that I found in a dumpster, and I electrical taped it to a piece of wire and made my own plug. So that is very unsafe, but it hasn't caught fire yet despite getting really hot. But I'm sure it's fine. So now it's just a question of seeing if this thing actually develops in any sensible, logical way, or if it just dies from excessive poisoning and whatever I put into it, which I'm not 100% sure it'll do either. But we'll see. I have further modified the system. The water was not exactly the correct pH to grow the grass-like microsword or the Java fern, so those were removed. However, one thing I did do is add a substantial amount more moss to the center. Where did that moss come from? I found it outside. So that's kind of a Darwinian survival of the fittest. If the moss continues to grow well there, then it lives there. Some of it doesn't grow well there and ends up dying. But the moss that does grow, grows. And although this camera does not have the resolution to see them, very tiny organisms have begun to develop in the lower level. The lower level mostly contains this sort of algae and dirt, although some of the plants, there's a random seed there for some reason that's turning into a plant, and in the back there's kind of a sprig of something. I'm going to try to add more plants to the base. Those all came out of a drainage ditch I was walking around in. Weirdly found a Salvadorian ID and an empty passport case down in the bottom, but I'm not going to think too hard on that. But anyway, the organisms that like to swim around in there are very tiny circular crustaceans, which usually occur in fresh water like this. So I'm going to try to promote them, maybe add some fish food to get them growing, and I'm going to try to find some snails to enhance the situation. Otherwise, I'll allow this to continue to function. I also upgraded the light slightly, so it's now not as flammable as it used to be. Very tiny worms. Not super visible, but they're definitely in there. Let's see if I can zoom in. Wow, this camera's better than I expected. As you can see, there's some very, very tiny worms in there, doing very tiny worm things. Very tiny crustacean looking things. Oh, my hands are too shaky. Look at them go. Observable here are slightly larger worms as well as small shrimp. I believe these are tubifex or bloodworms. Their constant undulation is their way of breathing, I think, because they normally live in a low oxygen environment. So that's how they go about getting their oxygen. That thing that's moving on the bottom, the small round seed-like things, appear to be a variety of crustacean. My phone fell over. In this area, multiple worms are apparent, as well as the small crustaceans. The worms tend to exist in the lower strata, where the sand interfaces with the rocks. These, I believe, are larger versions of those small worms that were observed earlier.
Here is a pond snail and a few little baby snails. The snails have been reproducing pretty consistently in the environment. This plant, I believe, is a form of Ludwigia, which is actively growing quite aggressively in the confines of the terrarium. Now these are a little more difficult to see. Far to the left there, and one just went and hid. Those are small crustaceans. I believe they're called ostracods. Whereas more over there, wiggling its little feelers, you can see some sort of insect. Located roughly centrally, and it may be tough to see, there's a cluster of them. Hydra. Hydra are they're a cnidarian, so kind of like a jellyfish or sea anemone. They sit attached to plants, usually, and they eat small passing organisms. Some of them are actively reproducing right now, which they do by splitting and that guy there almost caught that guy, but he got away just in time. The much smaller creatures you can kind of see swimming around the plants are probably what they're more adept at catching. Oh, looks like he's got him. I don't know, it looks a little big. He might still be able to get away. Oh, he's escaping, but that other one's got him. They do have weak venom, so if it can get through his shell, he'll be paralyzed. Oh, and there comes a copepod. Oh, he really jumped. So I don't know entirely how long it's been, but the system has developed quite considerably. These grasses that I've planted in the corner have developed roots all the way down into the sand section. And the Ludwigias, which are these plants here, have grown quite extensively. There's remnants of some of the surviving microsword. A lot of it has been moved to a different aquarium, but it's still growing like throughout here. The central column has been filled in. You know how it kind of looked a little weird where it had different sections and such. It's now been fully planted with all sorts of moss, which is growing all over the place, which seems to do well in an aquatic and semi-aquatic environment. The water level is a little variable, so sometimes it gets down all the way to here, and sometimes I fill it up. I've turned the pump off right now. The amount of foaming has gone way down, but it does produce an upwelling that can water the moss and keep it growing. There's also, it's a little dead right now, but I found some nose-stalk algae, which I put up there. From the other angle, there's another piece of grass in the corner over here. So this is remarkably successful, I think. The organisms it contains right now are probably 3 or 4 species of very tiny crustaceans, pond snails, hydra, and I've seen at least 2 types of insects moving in the upper areas along the moss and also crossing the top of the water and on the plants, plus 1 or 2 species of worm that live in various levels. There's kind of crawling worms that live up top, and then the sort of undulating bloodworms that live on the bottom. So I would consider this to be a remarkable success considering my usual quality of product, and I'm pretty astounded at how far it's come, even in this relatively short period of time. I'll continue to make minor modifications as necessary. You can kind of see in the distance I've added a few air plants that were, I was pruning some dying air plants that I had, so I picked off the live pieces and sort of put them in between the cracks. So it'll continue to grow, but this really, I think, was pretty successful. Considering how it started, the only main deficiency was just how much smoke it made when I made that concrete, but that has done pretty well in the center of it. So I would say that this is a success. You can build your own in either a small aquarium, a big transparent bowl, really whatever vessel holds water and can hold plants. With that said, I may put future versions of this as it grows into sort of the long-term review category of, what does it look like in a year? But this is successful enough that I think I can safely conclude this video. So, end.